Most fighters train for years just to survive one round. ButterBean, he ended fights before the crowd even sat down. With 400 pounds of unstoppable force, he didn't just fight, he dominated. Legends respected him. Even Mike Tyson knew better than to joke around. This is the knockout story you weren't ready for. Before the bright lights, before the knockouts, before the roar of the crowd chanted ButterBean like a war drum, there was just Eric, a kid from Jasper, Alabama, with a body that got him bullied more than praised. His weight wasn't a weapon back then, it was a curse. At school, kids didn't see strength. They saw fat. Laughter followed him like a shadow, and confidence, that was reserved for other kids, the skinny ones, the fast ones. Not him. Eric Esch wasn't born into boxing royalty. He didn't grow up with a golden glove or a rich trainer guiding his every move. In fact, he never really wanted to fight. All he wanted was to feel seen. But life doesn't always play fair. After high school, money was tight. His mother had passed away, and grief has a strange way of sneaking into your habits. For Eric, food became comfort. His weight ballooned, depression followed, and soon he found himself working the graveyard shift at a local manufacturing plant, a heavy body with heavier thoughts. But sometimes fate delivers a punch disguised as a flyer on a telephone pole. One night during a cigarette break, he saw it. Toughman contest, $1,000 grand prize, no experience necessary. It was basically bar brawling with gloves, a chaotic underground slugfest where amateur fighters could swing haymakers for a paycheck. It was brutal, messy, often ridiculous, but to Eric, it was an escape. So with no real training and carrying over 400 pounds of body weight, he signed up. Just like that, a man who had never boxed professionally, not once, was now about to fight in front of a crowd who came for blood and spectacle. And nobody, absolutely nobody, expected him to win. Not even Eric. But here's the thing about being underestimated. It becomes your greatest weapon. The lights were hot. The ring smelled like sweat and stale beer. The crowd, drunk, loud, and bloodthirsty. They didn't come for technique. They came to see someone get flattened. And standing awkwardly in the corner, gloves too tight, breathing heavy before the bell even rang, was Eric Esch. He didn't look like a fighter. He looked like the guy who delivers kegs. His opponent, younger, shredded, bouncing on his toes like he'd been waiting for this his whole life. The bell rang, and like a bullet, the guy charged. The first punch smashed into Eric's gut. The second grazed his chin. And then, just as everyone expected Eric to fold, he didn't. He absorbed the hits, took them like they were slaps from a toddler. And then, without warning, he threw a right hook that seemed to bend time. Crack. The skinny kid hit the mat like he'd been hit by a freight train hauling gravy and vengeance. The crowd froze, then erupted. That night, Eric Esch knocked out 3 fighters, all younger, all leaner, all convinced they were going to humiliate the fat guy. But they didn't know. This wasn't fat, it was armor. And from that moment on, Eric Esch was gone, replaced by a legend in the making, ButterBean. The name came from a sponsor. A joke at first, but it stuck. It was funny, unexpected, and somehow perfect. It became his brand, his identity, his battle cry. The Toughman circuit loved him. Crowds showed up just to see him demolish some poor soul in 20 seconds flat. His matches didn't last long, but they were spectacular. Fists like jackhammers, power that came from somewhere else. It didn't matter that he had no footwork, or that his style was more bar brawl than boxing. He won again and again and again. In his first year, ButterBean racked up over 60 victories, most of them knockouts. Promoters couldn't get enough. They saw dollar signs. TV networks took notice. Even Don King, the kingmaker of boxing, sniffed around. But not everyone was sold. To the traditional boxing world, ButterBean was a joke, a gimmick, a sideshow. They dismissed him as entertainment, not sport. But that only lit a fire in him. Because Eric wasn't in this just to be a novelty act. He wanted to prove something. That even if you didn't look the part, even if you didn't have the six-pack or the pedigree, you could still hit like hell and earn respect. And soon, ButterBean was about to step off the Toughman stage and into something much, much bigger. In the world of heavyweight boxing, fights are built to last. 12 rounds, 3 minutes each. a test of endurance, strategy, and stamina. But ButterBean, he wasn't made for marathons. He was built for shock and awe. So when he made the leap from Toughman contest to professional boxing, he did it on his terms. And he did something no one had really done before. He branded himself as the king of the 4-rounders. 4 rounds, that's it. No pacing, no dancing, no feeling out your opponent. You come out swinging or you don't make it out at all. And ButterBean, he made sure you didn't. He'd walk into the ring like a boulder in motion, bald head gleaming under the lights, American flag shorts, gloves bigger than most people's heads. The bell would ring, and within seconds, fists would fly like wrecking balls. One by one, opponents fell. It wasn't finesse, it was violence. He didn't need 12 rounds. He barely needed 1. His record began stacking up like a video game cheat code. 29-1, then 42-1, then 60-2. His first-round knockouts became so common, fans joked you had to finish your beer fast or you'd miss the whole fight. But here's the twist. Despite the novelty, ButterBean wasn't just a spectacle. He trained like a madman. He studied tape, he honed his timing, and though he was 400 pounds, his punches were precise, thrown with terrifying intent. He'd often spar with fighters half his size and twice as fast, not to chase speed, but to eat their punches and keep moving forward. It was a psychological game. Opponents would gas out trying to move around him. Then when they least expected it, he'd uncork a punch that could dent a Buick. He knew his weaknesses. He didn't pretend to be Muhammad Ali. But in those 4 rounds, he wasn't trying to outbox you. He was trying to end you. Networks began promoting him as America's everyman champion, a chubby icon in a sport dominated by sculpted physiques. He became a fan favorite, not because he looked like a superhero, but because he looked like your uncle who could still scrap at the barbecue. And yet the boxing world remained divided. Purists scoffed. He's ruining the sport, they said. He's a clown in gloves. But others saw what was really happening. A man rewriting the rules in real time. Fame followed. He appeared on late-night talk shows. He signed autographs for hours. He made cameos in movies and even threw hands in the WWE ring. But with every punch thrown, there was a quiet truth bubbling beneath the surface. ButterBean didn't just want fans, he wanted respect. He wanted to walk into a room of boxing legends, Tyson, Foreman, Holmes, and not be the punchline. So he set his sights on the one thing that could earn it, fighting a real champion. By now, ButterBean wasn't just a boxer, he was a spectacle. He was selling out arenas, headlining events, even making cameos in video games. Kids knew his name. Adults debated whether he was a fighter or a farce. But behind the success, the laughter was louder than the applause. Boxing elites called him a carnival act. Pundits labeled him the king of gimmick fights. And in locker rooms across the country, his name came with an eye roll. That guy, he's not a boxer. He's a brawler with branding. It stung, because ButterBean had earned every win, fought through pain, ridicule, and the limitations of a body most people would have written off. He wasn't born into this sport. He didn't have the perfect jab or the reach or the physique, but what he had was explosiveness. What he had was courage. What he had was a knockout power that could rearrange your family tree. But the hate, it wore on him. To the fans, he was lovable, a superhero in sweatpants. To the press, he was the Fat Tyson. But to ButterBean, he was just a man who never quit. Still, the circus followed him wherever he went. There was the time he boxed a grappler in an MMA-style ring before MMA was even mainstream. He knocked the guy out in 30 seconds. But the critics said, of course he did. The guy didn't know how to box. Then came the bizarre matchups. A fight against a professional bodybuilder with no real ring experience. A showdown with a karate black belt who tried to dance around him like he was in a Bruce Lee movie. And yes, even a dwarf boxing promoter challenged him to an exhibition match. It was madness, it was money, and it was tearing him in two. Because with every novelty fight, his credibility took a hit. But with every pay-per-view, his bank account smiled. He was stuck in a paradox. Be the punchline or get punched out of relevance. And then came the turning point. Atlantic City. The opponent, Larry Holmes, a real champion. former heavyweight king, the man who once went 15 rounds with Muhammad Ali and walked away with his dignity intact. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a gimmick. This was ButterBean's shot at respect, but it came at a price. The fight went the distance, all 10 rounds. Holmes, with his classic jab and ring IQ, controlled the pace. ButterBean, to his credit, absorbed punishment like a human wall and landed his own bombs. But in the end, Holmes won by unanimous decision. The critics exhaled. Told you so. But what they didn't mention? ButterBean hung in there for 10 rounds with a former world champion. No knockdown, no embarrassment, just grit, toughness, and a lot of sweat. It was his greatest loss, and somehow his greatest victory. But even that wasn't enough to stop the mockery. The boxing world still wouldn't let him in, and so ButterBean did the unthinkable. He stepped outside the ropes and into a cage. After the Holmes fight, something changed in ButterBean. Sure, he didn't win, but he proved something that night. To the crowd, to the critics, and maybe even to himself. He could hang with legends. He wasn't just the king of 4-round wars anymore. He was a man who stood in the same ring as a world champion and didn't fold. A man who ate jabs from one of the greatest technical boxers in history and still pressed forward. And that night earned him something he'd never fully had before. Respect. It wasn't universal. The critics still sneered, but the fighters, they started watching differently. You know who else was watching? Mike Tyson, the baddest man on the planet. And in a rare interview years later, Tyson was asked about fighters he'd never want to face in their prime. And ButterBean's name came up. "He's got power," Tyson said. "You don't play around with a guy like that. He could knock your head off." Let that sink in. Mike Tyson, who once bit a man's ear off and knocked people out before the national anthem even finished, was wary of ButterBean. Not because of his technique, not because of his size, but because of something far more terrifying. Unpredictable power in an unbreakable body. At this point, ButterBean had become more than a fighter. He was a cultural icon. He was starring in commercials. He was appearing in movies, most famously in Jackass the movie, where he knocked out Johnny Knoxville in a department store with a punch that echoed like thunder. He even made waves in pro wrestling, stepping into the WWF ring to battle Bart Gunn in WrestleMania 15, a fight that was supposed to be a playful exhibition, until ButterBean flattened Bart in 35 seconds. That was no choreographed takedown. That was a reminder. ButterBean was always real, but with fame came burnout, and the ring, for all its glory, started to feel too small. He'd knocked out boxers, wrestlers, actors, strongmen, and street brawlers. So what was next? ButterBean wanted a new challenge, a new frontier, and he found it in a cage. By the early 2000s, ButterBean had already conquered boxing's fringe and flirted with its elite. But he was getting restless. The spotlight was dimming, the novelty was fading, and the boxing world, forever cliquish, never fully opened its arms to the 400-pound phenom. So when an offer came to step into the cage, the MMA cage, he didn't hesitate. "Why not?" he shrugged. "It's still a fight, right?" That's the thing about ButterBean. He never claimed to be the best, but he never ran from a challenge. At nearly 400 pounds, with no real wrestling background, no jiu-jitsu black belt, and a body that hadn't done a single roundhouse kick in its life, he said yes. The MMA world scoffed. The keyboard warriors laughed. The analysts lined up to call it suicide. But once again, they underestimated the man. And once again, they were wrong. His first notable opponent? James Thompson, a towering British fighter known for brutal ground and pound. Young, fast, athletic. The kind of guy you'd expect to steamroll a novelty act. In the pre-fight interview, Thompson oozed arrogance. "I'm going to make it quick, clean, relatively painless." But when the bell rang, he walked straight into a freight train. ButterBean landed a looping right hand that made the cage rattle. Thompson stumbled, collapsed, and the referee jumped in before the damage could pile on. Fight over. The fat guy had just won an MMA fight against a legitimate opponent, and the world took notice. He followed that up with wins against other trained fighters. Wesley "Cabbage" Correia, a Hawaiian brawler with a steel chin, and Zuluzinho, a 6'7", 400+ pounds beast from Brazil. These weren't gimmicks, these were real fights. And yet, even as ButterBean found success, there were limits. In MMA, you can't just rely on punches. Grappling, submissions, endurance, they matter. And at times, the gaps in ButterBean's game became painfully clear. He suffered brutal losses. There were moments when faster, smarter fighters would take him down early, neutralizing his hands before he ever got a chance to throw them. On the ground, the mountain of power that ruled boxing became immobile. The tide was shifting, and age was catching up. But even in defeat, ButterBean never made excuses. He showed up, he fought, he lost with dignity and won with force. Because in the cage, just like in the ring, ButterBean stood for something primal. What happens when raw power meets sheer will? He wasn't the best striker, he wasn't the best grappler, but if you slipped up for even a second, lights out. He didn't need your belt, he didn't need your approval. All he needed was one shot, and if he landed it, you were done. But as the years went on, the toll of the wars, in both boxing and MMA, began to show. The next chapter wouldn't be about knockouts. It would be about survival. For most of his career, ButterBean's body was a fortress, a wall of muscle and mass, impervious to pain, swallowing punches like Skittles. But no wall stands forever, and for Eric Esch, the cracks began forming quietly. At first, it was just stiffness in the knees, then the back pain. Then the weight that once made him iconic became his greatest enemy. He wasn't moving like he used to. Training hurt, sleeping hurt. Even walking was becoming a struggle, and the man who once made a living bulldozing fighters across 3 different sports could barely make it down the stairs. He ballooned past 425 pounds. The knees, bone on bone, the back, shattered from years of absorbing force few humans ever experience. And the worst part, he felt forgotten. The cameras were gone, the crowd noise faded, and the world, once enamored with the myth of ButterBean, had moved on to newer, shinier stars. But the pain wasn't just physical. He began battling depression. The man who had once been a human storm, electrifying arenas with a single punch, now sat in silence, struggling with a bottle of painkillers just to get through the day. The fame that once made him feel invincible had become a ghost that haunted him. There was a moment, low, quiet, dark, where he wondered if it would have been better to die young and legendary than to live long and broken. And then something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No Rocky montage, no camera crews, just a decision. I'm not going out like this. He reached out for help, talked to doctors, began the agonizing process of transformation. The painkillers? Gone. The diet? Overhauled. The workouts? Brutal. Every step hurt. Every breath was a fight. But then again, he'd been fighting his whole life. And slowly the giant awoke. He started dropping weight, 10 pounds, 20, then 50. He began posting updates online. Fans started commenting again. Not with mockery, but with love. We missed you, champ. You got this. Still the baddest. And ButterBean, for the first time in years, smiled not because of the spotlight, but because he felt alive again. He didn't want to fight in a ring anymore. He didn't need that. He just wanted to be healthy, be present, be a husband, a father, a man. And that's what made the comeback so much sweeter. Not a comeback to boxing, a comeback to himself. Eric ButterBean Esch will never be remembered as the most technical fighter. He didn't dance around the ring like Ali. He didn't have the footwork of Tyson or the combinations of Holyfield. But he had something else. Not just the kind measured in pounds per square inch, but the kind forged in pain, self-doubt, and pure defiance. He came into a sport that worshipped lean muscle and perfect physiques and rewrote the rules by existing. By showing up. By knocking the smug grins off the faces of fighters who thought they'd get an easy win. He became a global symbol. He was mocked until he started winning. He was doubted until people stayed down. He was laughed at until the laughter turned into applause. ButterBean didn't just entertain, he inspired. He gave hope to everyone who was told they were too slow, too big, too unathletic. He made people believe that maybe, just maybe, the world didn't get to define your worth. You did. And his legend spread far beyond the ring. In video games, he was a playable powerhouse. In movies, he was an enforcer. In wrestling, he delivered real knockouts in a scripted world. He became an icon for every underdog who ever got underestimated. And maybe that's why even Mike Tyson, the most feared man in boxing, once said he wouldn't want to fight him. Because ButterBean wasn't just a fighter, he was a problem. And he still is. Today, he walks lighter, not just in weight, but in spirit. He's clean, he's focused, and he's finally at peace with the man behind the myth. "I'm not ButterBean anymore," he once said. "I'm Eric, and I'm proud of both." So what is his legacy? He didn't win world titles. He didn't make billions, but he won hearts, and he made a mark. In a sport filled with egos and gold belts, he gave us something rarer. A reminder that greatness comes in all shapes, and sometimes the biggest punch, the loudest cheer, the most unforgettable name, belongs to the man they said didn't belong at all. Fame fades, muscles shrink, cheers die out. But impact, that lingers. Eric Esch, the man the world knew as ButterBean, doesn't sell out arenas anymore. He doesn't flatten bodies in 30 seconds or crack late-night hosts up with his knockout highlight reels. These days, he's more likely to be seen walking his dog, answering fan questions online, or posting a selfie from the gym, 150 pounds lighter and decades wiser. And yet, the ButterBean myth endures. It's tattooed into the culture. From barbershops to boxing forums, from TikToks to throwback ESPN reels, his name still pops up like an urban legend you're not quite sure was real. Remember that big guy who used to knock people out in 20 seconds? Yeah, we remember. Because ButterBean was never just a boxer. He was a cultural phenomenon. He burst into a sport obsessed with grace and gave it gravity, literally. A man who flipped the script on what a fighter should look like. He didn't sneak through the ropes like a shadow. He stormed into the ring like a runaway train. And win or lose, you were going to remember him. But what's remarkable isn't just the spectacle, it's the way his story still lands today, maybe even more powerfully now. Because in a world obsessed with filters, abs, and curated highlight reels, ButterBean represents something so rare it feels almost rebellious. Authenticity, no gimmicks, no excuses. Just a man who dared to step into an unforgiving sport with a body the world mocked and prove that power, resilience, and spirit aren't measured in six-packs or sponsorship deals. And that resonates, especially now. Today, when influencers flood feeds with impossible standards and athletes are carefully manufactured for marketability, ButterBean stands as a reminder of the raw, the real, and the relentless. He was an everyman who became an anomaly, a punchline who became a powerhouse, and a myth who somehow became more human the older he got. But behind that, there's something even more inspiring: evolution. See, most fighters don't get a second act. They ride the highs, burn out, and fade into bitterness or addiction. ButterBean almost did too, but he clawed his way out of the hole. He shed not just the weight, but the self-doubt, the dependency, the need for validation from a sport that never truly accepted him. And that version of Eric Esch, that's the version that matters most. Because redemption stories aren't just about comeback fights. Sometimes the bravest battle is waking up, looking in the mirror and saying, "I deserve better. I'm going to fight for me." That's where he is now, healthier, happier, still swinging, not in a ring, but in life. He mentors young fighters, shares his story at schools, spreads messages about mental health, addiction, and perseverance. He's turned his past into purpose, and people are listening. Because when ButterBean speaks now, it's not with a roar, it's with wisdom. The kind that only comes from losing, failing, and getting back up again and again. And make no mistake, his influence is still growing. You can see it in MMA gyms where big guys who once thought they'd never fight now step into cages with confidence, because ButterBean did it first. You see it in body-positive movements, where his story is often cited as proof that strength isn't about fitting in, it's about standing out. You even see it in Hollywood, where gritty underdog tales echo his arc. Underestimated outsider, scrappy rise, bittersweet triumph. And yet, ButterBean never asked to be a role model. He just was. Because there's something universally powerful about defying expectations, about turning laughter into legacy, about making the world eat its words, one punch at a time. Now, as Eric approaches the later years of life, he's more reflective. He's talked openly about his past mistakes, about the pain behind the persona, and about the desire to be remembered. Not just as the guy who knocked people out in funny shorts, but as the guy who never stopped getting back up. "I didn't win all my fights," he once said, "but I showed up, and I didn't quit. That's all I ever wanted to teach my kids." And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the knockout reels, not the viral clips, but the message underneath it all, that you can be broken and still rebuild, that you can be doubted and still deliver, that you can be laughed at and still leave legends in your wake. ButterBean's story isn't over. It lives on, in gyms, in memories, in highlight reels that still make people cheer. But more importantly, it lives on in everyone who's ever been told they're not built for this. Because now they can look in the mirror and say, neither was ButterBean, and look what he did. Final reflection, he was too fat, too slow, too different. But somehow ButterBean turned every insult into ammunition. He made people laugh, then made them gasp. He may not have fit the mold, but he broke it. So the question isn't, was ButterBean a real fighter? The question is, what the hell is a real fighter anyway? Absolutely. Here's a final bonus chapter to close out ButterBean's story with depth, nostalgia, and a touch of open-ended legacy. This chapter will explore his life after fame, his unexpected impact on culture, and where his story still echoes today. He didn't have the look, he didn't have the pedigree, but ButterBean had the one thing every legend needs: heart. He turned ridicule into roar and punches into pride. So was he a joke or a genius? Maybe both. One thing's for sure, the world won't forget ButterBean anytime soon.